This is Dr. Ted Vokes, and you're listening to the Tools of the Trade podcast.
Welcome, please welcome
to another episode of the Tools of the Trade podcast, your number one construction industry resource. Hear conversations with industry professionals to get the tools, stories, and advice that you need to set your career on fire. You're now streaming the Tools of the Trade podcast.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode number 27 of the Tools of the Trade podcast. I'm your host, Colin Toop, and I created this podcast to not only help change the optics of the construction industry, but to provide apprentices, journey persons, small business owners, executives, and everyone in between with the valuable resources that they can use to accelerate their professional growth and leadership. And if you're listening, that definitely means you. So we are in the midst of COVID-19. And if you're like me, you're probably feeling pretty restless right now. I have actually been having dreams of hanging out with friends in public, going for a drink, grabbing dinner, and it's been, how do I say it? It's been strange. It's been a weird feeling. I was fine at first, and now I'm starting to feel a bit restless, which is why I felt that today's episode was a rather timely release given the current state of affairs, the current circumstances. Today's guest is Dr. Ted Vokes. Dr. Vokes holds a bachelor's in psychology from York University, as well as a master's and Ph.D. in industrial and organizational psychology. I put out a call to action a little while ago when the novel coronavirus started to hit us, looking for professionals that could speak to what we are experiencing and how to deal with it, which is how I got in touch with Ted. Ted is a founder of Vokes Ph.D. and Associates, and he has over 25 years of experience as a consultant to a wide variety of public and private sector organizations, including automotive, airline, retail, power generation, agriculture, telecom, petrochemical, emergency response, and public health. I was completely awestruck after having our conversation, as I felt as though a lot of light bulbs really turned on for me about human behavior and the way that we act. So here's a short summary of what's to come. What is organizational psychology? Besides financial constraints, what are the largest fears and or problems that organizations seem to be facing? How our limbic brain and prefrontal cortex work? What stimulates them, and what is happening to our brain in this state of panic, boredom, and loneliness? How we can work productively from home, both personally and as a team, and what tools we can use to combat the reactions our limbic system is having right now. To get in touch with Dr. Vokes and his organization, visit www.vokesassociates.com. That's VOKES associates.com. And to say hello to Ted on social, you can find him at Ted Vokes on Twitter. In the words of Dr. Vokes himself, stay prefrontal. Now let's go to school. Well, Ted, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I usually don't intro my guests live, but I'm looking at your bio here, and you're currently the senior partner in private practice, specializing in leadership development, executive coaching, culture assessment, strategic planning, mediation and dispute resolution, prevention of workplace violence. There's a huge list here. You've facilitated over 200 process consultation interventions, designed and conducted over 1,500 workshops, and your bio is amazing. It's filled with a lot of good stuff, and I'm very excited to talk to you. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast with me today.
Absolutely, we're absolutely honored to be here. Thank you so much, Colin. And my mom wrote all that stuff, so probably sound better than it is. But yeah, that's what we do, for sure.
Very cool. So I wanted to get some more COVID-19 resources out there from the construction side, and I've released a few already, but I feel as though you have quite a background to help deal with this kind of thing. And you also have the psychology piece baked into it, which I think is going to help. But I think, as we talked about before we got on the call, is how about we delineate what type of psychology we're talking about, if any references come up in this interview, so people understand what we're speaking about.
Perfect. Thank you. And yeah, our branch of psychology is not the one that most people think of when they hear the word psychology. They often think of clinicians and treating psychological disorders, that sort of thing. We don't do that. We refer when people in the workplace indicate that they need that kind of support, but we really practice our whole practice in workplace psychology, with fancy term organizational industrial psychology, but it's about people in the workplace. So if you have people in your workplace, their psychology, and that's the kind of psychology that we speak to. Often it does come around that we're brought in by leadership, and there'll be leadership and culture type issues. COVID introduces some really interesting new dynamics to leadership for sure. If you're dealing with any kind of workplace, and we work right across the full spectrum of workplaces, from big agri and airlines to manufacturing, auto, and public sector, in terms of municipal and provincial governments, and that sort of thing. So we're right across the board that way, and we work from Canada. We work internationally as well, with a lot of large corporations and small ones.
Okay, cool. So a place I like to get started quite often with my guests is to understand exactly what their role is. So, title wise, what do you call yourself? And what does a day in your life look like from kind of the time that you get up and you're starting to think about your workday till the workday is over? What happens in a day in the life of Ted? What does Ted do while he's working? What does that look like?
The first thing that Ted does is he relies on an amazing team of other practitioners to work with and to see who's doing what in what client organization. Okay, back to title. Yeah, I mean, my doctorate is in applied social psychology, specializing in organizational industrial psychology. And I am an adjunct professor in psychology and psychology department at University of Windsor, and with the Odette School of Business as well, where I teach periodically. But that's only about 10 to 15% of the time. The vast majority of time we're out here in the world. I'm working with a team of about 25 practitioners with various backgrounds, who all bring specializations and skills to the table. So a typical day is going to be very, to a degree, predictable, in that we know which clients we're going to be working with a given day. It may be training. We've moved all of our training online now, but be face to face, leading leadership labs, that sort of thing. Could be intervening in workplace assessments, culture assessments, trying to figure out where the power dynamics may be skewed in an organization, where there's some infighting and some power politics that are functioning, that are keeping an organization from achieving its potential. So we do full blown culture audits, which could take days, weeks, in some cases with large corporations, months, to figure out. We do workplace surveys. I pass that off to our statistics specialists in that, but we tailor those kinds of things. So the diversity of what we get to do is astounding. Sometimes we're in the office, sometimes we're out of the office, sometimes we're traveling to Miami or to British Columbia and Alberta, but more or less we are based out of Ontario, and try and keep the travel to only necessary, because that brings a lot of time, and we can do a lot. We were doing a lot before COVID through Zoom and through the various video mediums and things.
It sounds like an interesting job that you guys have, and it does sound like it's different every day. And that kind of leads me into wondering how you got into this in the first place, how you decided to have a practice like this, and how it all started from the seed to where it is now, how the organization came to be.
Thank you for the question. I set out to have a career in the Canadian Forces, and I was in the reserves while I was doing my undergraduate degree in psychology at York University. And I was kindly offered some directions with the regular force if I chose to go in that direction after my bachelor's. But I also wanted to pursue a PhD and answer questions about leadership that I had coming from my training in the military, and having the opportunity to train in leadership as my role in the forces. And the military didn't really know what to do with a PhD in applied social psychology at that time. And so I had to make a choice. Am I going to stay with the military and go full time, or am I going to pursue graduate degree without ever wanting to become a full time faculty member? I never wanted that. I mean, I respect that, and we draw upon what full time faculty do all the time to inform our practice. All our practice is theory based, but I really wanted to start up a private practice, which is what indeed we have done, and we've grown to about 25 members in different functions and capacities with the practice, and it's very rewarding. And like I
It
said,
sounds like it.
never 2 days in a row that are identical.
I guess it would have been no 2 days similar in the military either, especially if you were enlisted and brought overseas. That would have been crazy. It must have been a tough decision because it's two completely opposite ends of the spectrum. One is potentially going into live combat, I'm assuming, and the other one is taking a civilian role, but using the leadership that you've garnered from your experience in the military to deliver that to others. So that's an interesting choice that one would have to make in their life. How old were you when you had to make that decision?
I was 24 when I had to really make that decision. I was able to stay in the reserves a little bit longer than that, but by that I had to decide. And a lot of good friends stayed in. In fact, we're honored to have one of our partners was somebody I had the privilege to work with when I was in reserves. He went regular force and stayed in, and then retired from Canadian Forces Intelligence, and is now one of our partners. So, and he was in combat. I never was. So he has experiences that are astounding, like you said. And I was never deployed like that, nor was that my. But yeah, there was that decision point that we had to make, and you always wonder what would have been like had it gone the other way. But I'm pretty pleased with the way it's certainly going so far.
Yeah, it looks like it for sure. And you work with such a diverse range of public and private sector organizations from, like you mentioned, automotive, airline, retail. I see injection molding, power generation. It's almost seems like there's a bit of a pattern, a bit of a niche, but it's also widespread as well. So, how did you find your way into those organizations? Because from my experience in business, each organization is different. The type of culture they're going to have is different, especially based on what type of products they're selling or what they're manufacturing or what they do as an organization. So, how did those kind of become the organizations that you guys decided to work with or that you started to work with?
Yeah, and our practice grows really by referral, by word of mouth. And so we haven't set out to target particular sectors. I interned in the mental health field, not doing mental health, but supporting a mental health, large mental health facility in team development, leadership development, and things like that. And that led into the hospital sector, and that led into government. And people will say, "We've got this problem. Do you know anybody who knows anything about that?" And thankfully, CEOs and executive directors would say, "Well, you should call these guys." And so we have branched out into many sectors and feel privileged to do that. Again, at the end of the day, it's just people. They're coming together with a mission. They all have very different missions, like you point out. And you're absolutely right. The cultures are really different. You would think that the military would have a uniformity of culture right across it, and indeed, it does not. But that doesn't mean that cultures are dysfunctional. It just means that the people that make up an individual unit have the basis of the military culture, but they will enact that uniquely, unit to unit. You know, even the military doesn't get uniformity of culture. And the same thing, you could be in two different facilities with the same corporation and see two different cultural dynamics operating. And so it's, as I say, is a little known branch of psychology, more or less, maybe a little bit more known in the States and in Europe, but still not the first thing that people think of when they think of psychology. We feel pretty fortunate to be reached out to from such a broad range of sectors. CEOs talk even if they're in different industries.
For sure. It's lonely at the top.
It is for them. There is a real truth to that, and any leader, not just the CEOs. And then we were connected to HR circles, and so the HR directors and VPs and whatnot will say, we might not have the skill sets that you guys do to supplement what we need here. So we tend to partner long term with our client organizations and try to become a resource to them for some of the thorny or psychological dynamics that they might encounter in the workplace.
Amazing. That brings two questions to mind, and I know that we're trying to stay on the topic of COVID, but I'm just so interested in what you're doing. And one of the things that comes to mind is we talk about culture, and that word comes up a lot. And I feel as though it's beaten to death a lot in the media, and a lot of businesses are constantly focusing on generating that culture. And I was hoping that you could kind of define what the word culture actually means, because I think there might be a misconception in there. It's the same thing like I associate a lot of these buzzwords together. We've got passion. Everybody's looking for their passion. I want to do the job I love. Everybody's looking to build the culture everyone wants to be in. So I'd like to hear from your side of the of the coin, somebody that's dealt with a lot of cultures, what exactly that means at kind of the grassroots level.
Well, I wish more people would ask that question. That reveals so much insight into how organizations actually work. Culture trumps everything. You can have any organizational structure. You can have any set of policies and procedures. You can have very complicated or straightforward collective agreements. Culture determines how any of that actually gets implemented or not gets implemented, right? Culture will determine, do you follow your policies and procedures or not? And that's why we say culture is the single largest determinant of how work gets done. Now, what is culture? That's the real gist of it. And first of all, it's vitally important. And so what is it? Well, the standard answer is one that we accept, but then we add onto. The standard answer to culture is your habits, norms, rituals, the informal ways that people interact on a day-to-day basis to get the work done, and sometimes not so elegantly done when culture is dysfunctional. But the thing that isn't part of really even the social sciences approach to culture is power, social power. So our work in applied theory development, we have a whole team within our practice that does this. One of the PhDs in our practice is the director, an amazing thinker, and he doesn't. We don't tend to let him out very much to interface with clients because we have so many needs for him and his team to bring meaningful theory. And we've developed work on 10 different forms of social that is really not well known. But when we train people in what those forms are, they go, oh, okay, so I use all 10. I just didn't think of it as power. And culture, at its core, is how these 10 forms of power are routinely deployed in a workplace. And are they deployed in ways that are lead people to be able to be trustworthy of others? Do they feel safe, psychologically safe in the workplace? Or are those forms of power used in coercive and threatening kinds of ways? Because the forms of power are not good nor bad. It's how they're deployed and towards what end. And so part of a culture audit, a big part of it is going to be power analysis. How is power deployed? Who's got it? And who should have it, maybe doesn't. We all know the org chart in the wall. Well, that's a statement of your intended legitimate power is one of the 10 forms. And then we'll say, now show us how it really works. Okay, because here's this executive assistant over here, and they actually are the gatekeeper. And if you don't have a good relationship with this particular executive assistant, you're not going to get to the CEO, or you're not going to get to the VP of, right? So they actually have much more power than would be the intention. But that's culture. Culture determines that you better stay on the good side of that particular executive assistant. Now, executive assistants make the world go round, but sometimes they can have an inflated amount of power where a vice president can't get their way because that executive assistant has amassed power, been given power that is out of alignment with what they ought to have. And so power really defines culture. And so once you know these 10 forms of power and are able to see them unfolding before your eyes, once you learn to see them, you can also say which forms of power are supportive of the mission, because there's a culture set with the mission, and or are we burning time, attention, and energy that we can't recoup, but is going towards ends that have nothing to do with why we're here, why we're collaborating to achieve it. So you've seen organizations, and sometimes you wonder, how do they get anything done around here?
Yeah.
And other organizations that say, wow, this is a well-oiled machine. Like everyone's on board, everyone has an ability to bring forward ideas, be creative. It's psychologically safe in that case. In other cases, it's psychologically not safe, and people have to engage in using power strategically for self-protective reasons. So the work gets done, but at a great cost to time, tension, energy. Even we can even quantify that in terms of dollars lost. Like we've got dysfunctional power politics going on that if they weren't going on, you'd just be cutting through to get the job done.
Do you think that sometimes employees are unaware that their culture is dysfunctional because of the way that it's run?
Absolutely. Culture becomes habit, collective habit, and you can get just used to it. And you can say, well, just the way it is, right?
Right. That's so common.
Yeah, and or it's like this everywhere. And we have the privilege of working with some incredible organizations, and we can say, guess what? It isn't like this. It's not inevitable that you're going to have power politics in the workplace. I'm not being Pollyanna when I say this. There are some amazing, everything from small companies to huge corporations. The huge corporations are going to have different cultures within them for sure, and some will be more functional than others. But those corporations will take on, areas of cultural dysfunction when they spot it. They'll say that's not okay, right? So we're not looking for uniformity of culture. We're looking for though cultures that are psychologically safe, and therefore where I can trust how power is being used. If I feel like those with more power than me are using it for their own ends, for self-serving purposes, and the mission's getting accomplished, but really to their greater glory, to their greater power, I'm going to be pretty cynical. But that's all I've seen, like you said. I'm just going to accept it, right? And we're adaptive creatures, and we get comfortable with the familiarity of it, and often we come to a point where we won't challenge it, or I just don't feel like I have the power to challenge it. So
Got it.
yeah,
The second question that came to mind as you were speaking was, and it's a question I like to ask a lot of people that have a specialty, is you've seen a lot of companies come to you and you're most likely trying to solve some sort of problem within a business. And I was wondering if you can distill that down to any common themes. Is there any commonalities you notice that business come to you with as issues that they need resolved?
there's a lot. Usually it is around, and they may not frame it this way because, again, this idea of social power is not a common part of the way we think about the world. We'll say, oh, yeah, it's about power. It's always about power. People would become cynical about that. Understandably so. They're talking about the worst applications of power that they see, and they've been hurt by very often. So a lot of what we'll get presented with will ultimately be about power or the misuse of power. But a lot of it will say, oh, we have real difficulty with communications. And so we need to learn how to communicate better. We're certainly able to provide communications training. We've yet to provide communications training because it's always about power. So people are actually very good communicators. We have a very, very well-educated workforce right across, really North America, so I speak to Canada. So people know how to communicate. What they tend to be doing when somebody says we have a communications problem is they tend to be using communications, and information power is one of the 10 forms. They tend to be using very strategically, where I communicate to you, but I won't communicate to somebody who I see as a rival within the company. I'll sabotage them by withholding information, right? Or I'll distort information so that it's my department that made an error, but I'm going to get you to believe that it's another department that messed up, and then let you go. So it's almost always about how power is being used for legitimate purposes, correct purposes, mission aligned purposes, versus other ends that to take our time, attention, energy away from what's the mission of this organization, right? Is it
Yeah.
to build buildings? Is it to treat people in a hospital? There's always a mission.
Yeah. It's funny you say that. I've actually witnessed that type of culture where other people are doing things to make themselves look better so that they can be the ones that are next in line for that promotion or that raise at the expense of the organization or the project or at other people to bring themselves up the ladder, knowing that so and so's retiring or X position may become available. And as long as I make everybody else look bad, I'll get it. And they abuse the power and throw other people under the bus. And it's pretty crazy. And when you don't think about it really until you're in a larger organization, like it happens in small organizations too, but when there's more roles available and there's more moving parts, it's you witness it, and it's kind of crazy how people react. And that brings me right into the first sort of COVID related question that we said we would start with, was brain science. And I'm looking over your right shoulder and there's a big brain sitting on a table. So we know that we've got the brain scientist, well, not scientist, but we've got somebody in the house that can explain what's going on. So one of the things that we talked about before that we were going to answer here was, what is the brain typically doing? And as it relates to COVID, or it could even be with power, what is it doing then? So walk us through the anatomy of the brain and how it's functioning as we're experiencing these different things. And especially right now with COVID, what it's doing.
Yeah, and Terrific question. Yes, the brain over my right shoulder here is not a real one. It's actually, we consider it a member of our practice, called it Brian. And
Brian the Brain.
yes, and we take he comes apart so that we can actually show segments and various areas of the brains that are most active under different conditions. Right now, the way we're defining really the world on a scale is that we're in a crisis. No one's ever seen a situation like this before, who's alive today, and certainly never on a scale like this. We're not in an emergency, although emergencies happen within a crisis, right? So somebody who's struggling for life, there that's an emergency, but we're in a crisis, and so I set that stage to say that means that a particular portion of the brain, really the what we call the limbic system, is very, very active right now. And so let's say it was, a month ago that we sort of went into lockdown here in Ontario. Prior to that, the limbic systems of most people were not firing on a grand scale. As we saw, we were kind of wary. I guess there was some charging up of that limbic system. The limbic system, it's an impulsive part of the brain. It's an irrational part of our brain, but it's responsible for our survival, feeding, fleeing, fighting, sort of the raw sexuality of us is all in that center of the brain. And it is literally in the center of the brain. It's responsible for emotions like anger and fear, but also pleasure and feeling satisfied, right? And it also plays an important role in encoding memory, as it turns out, and that we'll maybe bring that in later. But if you think of it as right now, the survival brain, the brain that says there's an alarm, there's my alarm's going off, there's a threat out there, and my alarm's going off, and its responses are really quite basic, right? Fight, flee, or freeze. That's what the limbic system is all about. And right now, because ours is triggered, the threat that COVID is, it's hyper focused on threat. It really hates ambiguity. It's sort of a black and white system. Now, this is in counterpoint to what we call the prefrontal cortex. This part that, when you touch your forehead, you go through your cranium and you're into the prefrontal. The prefrontal is a very different system, but it works in concert most of the time with the limbic system. Its responsibility is for priority setting, problem solving, rational thinking, formulating a plan and then executing and anticipating the consequences of that plan. So if then kinds of relationships, right? And so it's very much about refined kinds of thinking. It's what we want to use in complex problem solving and conflict resolution. The problem is when we're in a conflict or in a threat situation, the limbic system can sort of override. The limbic system is designed to override any other process because it's there to keep survival going, right? So it's often called at these times the survival brain. And it's hyper aware of threat. It even takes ambiguity as threat. So just jumping ahead a little bit, if you're in your limbic brain and a boss is waffling about what's to come, the brain gets angry with the boss at that point, right? Whereas at other times when we're not so limbic, when the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex are working in concert as we would want them to be, okay, the boss doesn't know right now, the boss will tell us later. But right now, we want answers. We want it black and white. We want to know when's this going to end? How is it going to happen? And if you're not delivering that for us, we're not going to be comfortable sitting back and saying, okay, we'll get back to this, right? Because that fear response is so elevated in us. So the psychology that we've seen in the last month involving leadership is, leadership is one of the toughest things you're ever going to do in life because it demands things of the brain that the brain is challenged to do. And that's make a lot of predictions and look at a lot of moving parts and try and see how they're all fitting together. And now under a worldwide crisis, leadership just got a whole lot harder still. Because now you're dealing with different brain, your own going into that, right? Because it's not leaders are impervious to how the brain works. So they've got to find a way to cut through the limbic system, natural inclination towards even all the way to panic, depending upon how concerned they are. Plus, they've got to help their employees who are participating in a mission that needs to go on get sort of the prefrontal cortex realigned and working again. So we're dealing with a double challenge to leadership right now, and maybe a triple because leaders are human beings, and we have very high expectations on them for not going limbic, if you will,
Yeah.
right? And we give the example in the training. When was the last time you saw a paramedic, panic? Well, thankfully we don't, because they're so well trained that they know that if they panic, they're going to spawn that panic in others. They're going to set off the limbic system in others, other people.
Right. Right.
Right? And so they walk firmly, they walk calmly, they take control of situations. And we're so relieved when that happens. The same thing for leaders. We're looking for them to give us an image of them being in control so that can calm down our limbic system. That's what's happening. And so we're doing a lot of work to coach leaders on how to respond during this time to help their brains come down first. We talk a lot about leader self-care, and then how to help their teams re-online the prefrontal cortex and
Got it.
assess risk reasonably as opposed to maybe not so reasonably.
Yeah. So I've got two questions that come out of that. So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding you correctly, because if anybody is on social media, be it LinkedIn or Instagram, even if anybody is on a construction job site, these are two things I've witnessed. So on my LinkedIn, I've seen a lot of videos that have been posted about people that are basically, they're going onto job sites and they're being filmed, or somebody's filming somebody on a job site, and that person is saying, they're putting their hands up and they're getting very angry about the situation, and they're saying that they're getting very pumped up. And this one video in particular was actually on a Toronto job site, and I don't know who the company was, I don't know anything about it, but basically this guy stands up and he starts getting very aggressive in front of the whole group of people, and he starts raising his voice and swearing and talking about, you all have a choice. You can either walk away or you can stay. It's up to you. This isn't a sanitary job site. There's no way you can tell me that you're working less than 6 feet away from somebody else. This is absolute garbage, blah, blah, blah. And they're going, you see this guy, he's got this like rage about him. And then I've also witnessed that on job sites as things have started to shut down. You'll see other trades will kind of speak up when that leader is kind of saying, I don't have the answers for you. I don't really know what's going on. Here's just what the government told me to do. We're potentially looking at shutting down, or we're going to stay open, and you're going to have to maintain your distance. You have to sanitize, and you're going to have to wear a mask the whole time. And you see people they get this like spike of adrenaline, and all of a sudden they're fired up, and it must be like you mentioned, their limbic system is just saying it's going bonkers, and they get so aggressive and upset and angry at everything. And if it was a normal day, if it was like, the site isn't safe to work because of XYZ and you'll be back in a week, okay, no problem, we'll go home. But now there's so many unknowns, and your brain is, I guess, it's acting in such a way that it's causing people like to be angry. And if if that makes sense, then what can a leader do? And I guess anybody listening, what are those self-care practices that we can deploy to get the limbic system to calm down?
Yeah, brilliant. You're describing exactly people that have gone limbic, so to speak, right? And there's a whole bunch of neurotransmitters and hormones that are awash in there. When we were training and coaching in this area, we actually break some of that down just so that people can understand and recognize, right? Even your description of the first individual, very black and white. You can do this or you can do that, right? There's no nuance. There's no problem solving there, right? You can stay and risk your lives, or you can go home. And limbic responses are not just around threat. That's what we're seeing right now. But when your team wins, a championship, and you see the people flood out the streets and they're chanting, we're number one, we're number one. That's limbic, right?
The Raptors celebration party
That's
in
right.
downtown Toronto.
Yeah. At that point, people are chanting phrases. It's very repetitive. It's very base, right, in its nature. Well, this is the other side of that joy and collective celebration. It's that fear, and that you're putting me at risk, right? And I'm going to personalize. One of the interesting things about our brains is that we don't like to have an invisible enemy or a circumstantial enemy. We want to blame a face, right? We want to put blame on somebody. So right now, the fingers are really pointing as to who's responsible for COVID. Well, it doesn't really matter. I mean, yes, it's in the long term it does, but for getting us through this right now, pointing fingers and casting blame, isn't the most productive thing you're going to do, because we all have individual work sites, and we need to we need to focus on how we're going to keep one another safe and ourselves safe and get that structure built, or whatever we're there to do. So, but you described exactly the limbic brain operating, taking control. And, those individuals at other times could be the most reasonable people you could imagine. Okay, we have, like you said, okay, we got to shut the job site down for about a week. All right, we go home.
Mhm.
Right. So what do we do about that? Okay, well, first of all, leaders are human beings first. And so all of our limbic reactions are intense. And, we wrote a brief and we put it on LinkedIn. Anybody can download it on. So you're working from home. So those who are working from home, it's designed to help you, first step, calm your limbic system down. We don't talk about it that way, but we say, okay, make sure that you're not distracted by your own concerns about yours or your family's physical health and well-being. Deal with that first, so that you can create a space where your prefrontal cortex can come back online. We don't talk about all that. We just give, sort of standard kinds of things to do to help people into that space without them understanding what we're asking them to do. Once we get the leaders there and engaging in self-care, doing things to not be on 24/7 for 7 days a week, like many leaders were, and many employees and professionals have been as well, throughout getting sort of up and running post the onset of the COVID measures that have to be taken. So people are tired. So we emphasize self-care. So because you think about it, when are we most emotional? It tends to be towards the end of the day, right? And if you're going to have an argument with your spouse, it's probably going to happen at the end of the day, right? Because your reserves are down, your prefrontal cortex is a little bit more offline, the emotions are running a little bit higher, and so we tend to be more uh, prone to going limbic when we're tired. And so that's just end of day, normal day. This is now, I'm not replenishing my cognitive and emotional reserves. My sleep is disrupted. I'm anxious as I sleep. I wake up several times in the night. So I'm not fully my best in the morning. And then I've got all these challenges to deal with as I'm contending in the workplace. And I don't want to only emphasize leaders, but we're relying on leaders a lot. But there's lots of informal leaders. There's that person on the team that we all orient towards because they just make sense. They're kind of, so let's look at what they bring. What we're saying is, try to bring forward the best version of you. We call it an organization itself that exudes these three key components. We call them the three C's: confidence, calmness, and compassion. Okay? If you can create a version of you that is confident without being arrogant, this is where this calmness comes in. So it's high testosterone, which brings us into this confidence zone. Low cortisol, so high cortisol stress. So it's that confident person who's basically, okay, we're here to figure things out. And so there's a calmness that comes there too, the low cortisol. That's not quite enough though, because people are feeling extremely vulnerable. You have power. How are you going to use your power? Do you give a damn about it? Right? Are you aware that I'm frightened, but maybe I don't want to show that I'm frightened? So the compassion, or that sense of, it's going to be okay. We are going to get through this together, are really that combination that tends to help other people's limbic system come down. When we see this, we tend to mirror it, right? Oh, okay. So when that paramedic shows up and they're calm and collected, our brain goes, oh, I guess there's reason to be calm and collected right now. And
Right.
that's helpful. So part of showing that compassion is saying, I'm on your side. I'm part of your in-group. There's something very elemental about our limbic system too, which is to sense, who are our in-group and our out-group? Are you with me or against me? Are you somebody I can trust? Because if you're in-group, I can trust you. If you're my out-group, you're a threat to me already, right? So that compassion says, I'm with you. We're here together. So some of the most powerful phrases that leaders can use right now is, thank you for bringing this up. Okay, problems are solvable. Let's see what we can do together to solve this. Right? So I'm basically saying, we got this. It's going to be okay, and I'm on your side. right? And let's do this together, because we start to panic the minute we feel like we don't have an in-group, right? Or the person that we're looking to provide that kind of security and confidence can't be trusted. And so the confidence and calmness alone is not enough. You got to also say, we're in this together, not going to be abandoned, right? And you don't have to say those words specifically, but to convey that situation. It's an old story from I guess I think it's the Texas Rangers. I think conveys some of this in a way. It's there's a riot in a town, and a Texas Ranger shows up to deal with the riot, and the townspeople say, "What? They only sent one ranger?" And the ranger says, "Well, there's only one riot, so we're here. Problems are solvable. We're going to get there. I'm on your side." Right? And that demeanor, that way of being, even and again, understanding it's hard to bring that forward when your limbic system's going on, right?
Oh yeah,
So leaders that are able to bring themselves into that place actually bolster their own confidence. It's interesting. It helps them too, right?
for sure it does. Yeah.
Yeah. So now there will be people that are so limbic that even that isn't going to work in those moments. And sometimes you just got to let them run their course. If they're going to get aggressive, you may have to back away. If they're seeing you as their enemy, doing everything you can to say, I'm an ally, right? I'm part of your in group is a good way to go, and try and bring them down. And then after the fact, a lot of people will be quite embarrassed by the fact that they went limbic. They don't have the term for it, but not to hold that over them either, and to reinforce their calmness when they're giving it to you and saying, this is really helpful. Now, we got a lot to work with here. So you're inviting them into your piece as opposed to getting drawn into their story, if you will, right?
Yeah, got it. I'm going to start using that term, calling people limbic when they're flying off the handle.
Our clients use it now, honestly, because it is a useful short form. We give them crash course in brain science so they can understand wishful thinking isn't going to make the brain change, right? But
Yep.
there are strategies to help us lead people who are very limbic into a place where they can use their best. Their combination. The limbic is not our enemy. It's our ally. But when it's taken over, then you get that black and white stuff. Then you get that everything's a threat. Then if you can't tell me exactly what's going to happen and when it's going to happen, you're lying to me. You're deceiving me. So you almost can see people become a little bit paranoid in those times because they're not trusted. And
Yeah.
it could be somebody they've trusted for years, and yet their limbic brain says, can't trust. It's a tough time to lead.
For sure. So we've talked a lot about the leaders, and obviously the leaders are way smaller percentage than, I don't want to call them the followers, but everybody else that's a team member in the organization that is being led by somebody, they have a role to play here. And there's kind of two pieces to that we've talked about prior to this call, but also that come to mind is we have loneliness and boredom. And then we have the whole working from home piece. And I wanted to start with the boredom bit and what role boredom is playing in isolation and what our brain's doing when we're sitting around bored.
Yeah, like everything else about the brain, nothing's as simple as it sounds. Boredom and loneliness are two of the dynamics that people are obviously experiencing during social isolation. Not everybody is, but many, many people are. And I kind of want to circle back on your point about sort of everybody else. Everybody else can and does naturally play a leadership role too. They do shape
True.
culture, right? And I want to acknowledge that just because you're in a formal position of leadership doesn't actually perform the role of leadership. We've all had those people who no one actually goes to despite their title because they're going to get the real leadership from another team member, right? So it's not just the formal leaders that need to be doing this. You can provide this kind of leadership to amongst your peers too. So just to bring that up. Now back to boredom and loneliness. Boredom is far more complex, and it's not something that I had spent a lot of time studying prior to this. So I put our applied research team on this, and they brought back some amazing insights into what's happening with boredom. And it's basically more's going on there than we might like to realize. And it's full of opportunity and it's full of threat. And it sort of depends on what you're going to do with that boredom. That's a big dynamic when it comes to this. It's too difficult to overcome boredom simply by sort of following the well, learn a new language, or you've always said that you always wanted to do this and now you're not doing it, and so you're failing in some sense, right?
Hmm.
Boredom is this dynamic whereby we're either overstimulated or understimulated by what we're doing, and we can oscillate between the two, right? And we may have a lack of meaning in the things that we're doing at that point. And the best way to approach it without getting too deep a level about the various forms of boredom, and get yourself out of the quicksand that it can be, right? It can sort of draw you in, is to take on something that is not too easy and not too hard, right? So I may not want to launch into a new university degree or a new college degree to overcome my boredom at this moment. I may work towards that, but something that's sort of that sweet spot in the middle to pull yourself out of that quicksand. And part of boredom is also related to how much control I feel I have. And so if you're at home and you don't feel like you have a whole lot of control because you have to be at home, versus I'm doing a very repetitive task and the boss tells me I have to do this and it's really boring, right? These are
Right.
different conditions of boredom, right? It's not one size fits all when it comes to boredom. But the more we can put meaning to the actions, even if they are repetitive and not so interesting, the less likely we are to experience them as boring in that sense. And now here's I think one of the most useful pieces that our team came back with respect to boredom, and it relates to one of the neurotransmitters called dopamine. Dopamine is a very important neurotransmitter. None of the neurotransmitters are responsible for only one thing. They do a lot of things, but basically when we're bored, our dopamine levels drop, and we kind of want them at an optimum level.
Hmm.
So what happens is we look for something to engage ourselves, to give ourselves that dopamine hit. And you may have heard of social media and how it gives us dopamine hits. The
Yeah.
dopamine's working out there, right? And every like I get, it gives me a little dopamine hit, and I get charged up by that. So social media is something that we often turn to we're doing a boring thing. We'll surf the net. We'll surf Facebook. We'll go through these kinds of things, and oh, look how many likes I got, and that sort of thing. That's giving us the dopamine hit. The problem with this is the solution to boredom is that it's very short-lived. That dopamine hit is quick and it's over when you finish surfing. And if you've ever got sucked down that rabbit hole of watching these how-to videos
Too many
right, too many
times.
times, right?
5-minute DIY hacks and all this crap.
Oh, I'm as guilty, and although I work hard not to get drawn in as easily as it is, because it's giving us that dopamine hit. But here's the paradoxical thing about it: the brain's full of these paradoxes. What happens is we say, okay, all right, I'll stop surfing. I thought it was 20 minutes, and it's 3 hours later. Because that lost time thing happens in that state as well. We come out of it and we think, okay, well, I've charged up my dopamine, but now we actually get a bigger fall for having been in that fast hit of dopamine, as opposed to sort of a lasting satisfaction that comes out of taking out something that's in that middle ground, right? Because it takes no energy whatsoever to surf the web, right? You're just scanning, and so we actually can elevate our boredom when we come out of dealing with it through social media. So what you want to be doing is finding something that will engage you in that middle zone. It's not too easy, it's not too hard, that effectively gives you that lasting dopamine effect in that point. And so we feel better. So the quick term fixes actually accentuate how much boredom we're experiencing when we come out of it. So
Hmm.
it didn't remedy it, it actually made it a little bit worse, right? So what you want to do is look for an activity that has some inherent meaning to you, right? That is not too easy, not too hard, and is meaningful to you. It's not just sort of filling time, right? So maybe it's playing your favorite instrument and playing some of your familiar songs, and not pushing yourselves to take on something that's a really, really challenging song at that point, but you might work up to it, right? So you're building on a more lasting dopamine fix at that point, as opposed to the scanning social media and making your situation actually worse, as it turns out. So being strategic, and this takes a certain degree of strategy, right, for oneself. What are those things for me? Because they're different for everybody. Right?
Yeah,
They are. They're as unique as the people that we are. So that's the sort of the takeaway on boredom. There is quicksand to boredom, and there are ways out of it. You just got to be careful and really watch the social media at those times.
most
'Cause,
definitely.
yeah, it can make it worse.
And you mentioned staying focused, like that's for sure. I mean, when you're in the workplace, you have the eyes on you, so in the back of your mind that you can't just be sitting at your desk scrolling social media because you don't know who's looking over the corner. But when you're at home, you've got potentially your spouse in the other room, you've got your
Yeah,
animals, you've got your TV right across from you, you've got the fridge, which is a terrible thing to have within 10 feet of where you're working,
absolutely.
and then you've got wherever you decide to set up shop for the day. And it's very easy to just get up to go to the bathroom, get sidetracked, 20 minutes, 30 minutes goes by, or we now have the opportunity. A lot of people have been saying, I'm able to eat lunch actually for the first time,
Yeah,
and not at my desk, or I'm able to actually take a break. And maybe it's because people feel like they're not watched. I'm not sure, but it can be hard to stay productive. And I think, you mentioned that too. There's degrees of boredom. You may be doing a boring task at work, which is going to push you into the quicksand, and then you're going to be trapped on social media. And so how can we manage our productivity when we're working from home? Because boredom is going to come from that. I think especially you're just going to be bored looking out the same window or at the same wall all day and not being able to interact. So it kind of all commingles together and ties together to form what could be unproductive hours in a day. And I think everybody, including myself, is struggling with being unproductive for at least some of their day. And how can we deal with that?
a great question, and I wish there was a simple answer, but there are answers. So the first thing is to understand we're probably not going to be productive like we were before, but we can work up to that. And unfortunately, it looks like COVID is going to give us a lot of chances
Yeah.
to practice working from home, right? So we can get better at it. We're only a month into it, at least in my part of the world, and we are sort of landing on something of a new normal. So what we are hearing from a lot of our clients is that they feel a little more productive now than they did initially. And we can't actually be productive as long as that limbic system is firing and saying, we're at risk, we're at risk, we're at risk, because that's going to focus our attention. And I know a lot of people who finishing up, college programs when this all hit and things like that. And it's like, I was going great. And then this hit, and now I can't even focus. Why can't I focus? Like, I'm home more. I have more time to study and I can't study, right? And that
Hmm.
comes back to the limbic system sort of taking offline the learning system for those time periods. So normally I have no problem sitting down and looking at PowerPoints and studying and answering quizzes or tests. But right now it's not going in. And that's
Yeah.
because that limbic system is firing so much. And so one of the first things to do is do everything you can to give yourself that sense of security, to do the very best you can to mitigate risk in your environment. We're really fortunate we can deliver virtually everything that we do. So we've been able to keep going in our practice virtually. Many can't. Many don't have that luxury. We feel very fortunate for that, and are aware that that's good fortune for us, but a lot of people can't. So it can be really hard. Plus all the distractions at home, like you mentioned, the refrigerator to the kids to the animals. And I'll tell you, our cats have never been more cute than during COVID. Somehow they just grab hold of all of our attention. And so you've got a very unfamiliar space. There's a concept I alluded to earlier called organizations of self. And this is a concept that is not in the textbooks at this point. We know we got a personality, but we also have multiple expressions of ourselves. If you think of you in your job site, and then there's probably multiple versions of you at work. And those are probably different than when you were doing a very different job or with a very different company. You've created different versions of you to perform that. And if you're a parent, I've got a 16-year-old, and I have a dad version of organization of self that's different than Professor or Dr. Vokes, right? Or Ted with my best friend. Those are different expressions of me. Now, go deep into that, but that's normal. It's not multiple personality, it's multiple expressions of us in different situations.
Got it.
So now we're slammed into working, let's say, from home. And I've got my organization of self for being at home. Now I've got to bring in my organizations of self to be successful at working, but they don't belong at home, right? Because in my commute home from the work site or the office, I'm going through a process of shifting from work self to home self. And if I know my kids are already in bed, then I'm going to be more, husband self. But if the kids are still up, then it's going to be dad and husband self. And now I don't have even that space between work and home. I've got to be all of those versions of me at one time. And flipping between those versions can be exhausting, right? Where our brains are already tired because we've got a threat out there and we're assessing that all the time.
Yeah.
Right. And then I've got to shift between dad self and feed the cat self because they won't let me carry on a conversation, in the background. I don't have my familiar space around me for work. And that those cues themselves bring me into a work organization of self. And but all the cues I have around me are family self. Right? And so we've got all of this sort of confliction within ourselves that can be absolutely exhausting and frustrating. I need to be at work now. So could you please keep the kids away from me? Right?
Yeah.
Maybe you don't have that luxury, right? And maybe they're fighting in the background. And maybe you've got a parent there and you're having to care for them as well, right? There's no shortage of. So it's lovely if a grandparent can take care of the kids when you're home, but maybe you don't have that. Maybe you're taking care of them and your kids. And previously, you actually had a little vacation from that by going to work. And now I don't have that. And I still have to work. That's what's going on. How do we do that? We try and put in new structures to keep a space that is a workspace, right? We'll say, even if you can get a separate room for that, maybe you can get a corner of a room for that. And maybe you can talk to your kids about, hey, dad or mom, when I'm here in the corner, I'll tell you when I'm going to be available, but I need you to play and do what you need to do over there. You may still have to watch them from afar, but sort of set some new boundaries because they're adjusting too. They don't see you as your work self. We have a couple that they both work in different industries. They're both working from home, and they're both seeing one another on the phone. And they're going, "Honey, I never saw you like this before."
I know.
Like you're like what? Like you talk like that on the phone? That's so professional. Wow, I never see you like that. And so you're seeing different organizations of self of one another, and it's an adjustment. My son will come to a lecture every now and then and watch his father be professor, and then students will figure out because he's the youngest one in the class, oh yeah, that's your dad. So, is he like this at home? And he'll go, nah, he's not like this. He's different. You know,
Yeah.
right? So he sees the different versions and can compare and contrast. But that's a safe situation. This one is there's so much going on. I gotta produce. I gotta get this report out, or I gotta get this
Mhm.
quote put together. I've got to review this safety protocol, something like that. That is right in front of me, and I got to do that. Plus, I've got all these other distractions, other these organizations of self that are being demanded of me, and that is
Yeah.
hard for any brain.
And you know what? I think I'm kind of experiencing the opposite. So I've got no kids. It's just me and my wife. But because I have obviously my day job and I'm putting so much work in on the podcast, I actually can't stop. So it's easy for me to just unplug all my cords and bring the laptop to the couch and then answer the email in bed and then wake up and come straight back to the office. And now I forgot what day of the week it is, what time it is, what I'm actually doing. And I actually can't shut my work self off anymore. There's just no boundary. There's no break. There's no container to be home anymore.
Brilliant, right? So this is saturation and organization of self. The organizations of self that we have are actually in some sense interdependent, but not in really obvious kinds of ways. And I won't get too far down that, but just to say, now there are organizations of self that you cannot be. because maybe you play sports, right? And it's team sports. Well, that's not happening now, right? So I can't be my hockey self right now, and that's being, and so we're actually experiencing loss of organizations of self without an end date to this specifically. And we know it will end, but we don't know specifically when. So when can I resume hockey? Well, by the time summer rolls around, I can't even resume. I'm gonna have to wait till next season, before I could even ever entertain that. So we've been deprived of organizations of self as well, and so we're saturating within a few selves that are available to us, and that has a huge impact on us as well. We fatigue in being a restricted range of ourselves in that sense, right? So extroverts are about roughly 60% of the population. They're really struggling, but we're even seeing introverts struggle as well because they may not want to go out and go down to the club or the pub or something like that to recharge. But whatever they are going to do, spending one-on-one time with a close friend, going out with people to a movie or something like that, they're deprived of as well. But I think the extroverts, I'm introverted, and my extroverted friends, I feel even more for.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah. So it's saturation, and just too much of a good thing. And I love my work, but if I am only, my work selves, that's a bad thing too.
Oh yeah. It makes me think of all of those times, myself included, and a lot of people I know have said, "Oh, wouldn't it just be a dream to have that job where you can work from home every day?" Well, how do you like it now?
Yeah. Yeah, careful what you wish for.
Yeah, exactly. You get a real taste of what that's going to be like if that's what you decide to do.
True. Very, very true. Yeah. And it's going to be interesting. Our team is already trying to anticipate what post-pandemic is going to look like, and how people are. What's the psychology of coming back into those organizations of self that have been denied them? And we haven't got all the answers yet, but we're looking ahead to try and anticipate that for sure.
So, what are your preliminary thoughts? Because I know that we're coming up on time here, but that was kind of the last piece to tie it all together. Is where do you think society organizations are heading? I know that you haven't completed your research, but any preliminary thoughts or potential things that you guys have started to research? Anything at all that you can think of in terms of what the new normal may look like?
Yeah. Here's the thing about the brain. The brain's a prediction machine, right? It is constantly trying to figure out what's going to happen next. And yet, here's the weird thing about it. The brain is very poor at predicting, because the data, what data do we select, and how much is out of our ability to perceive it and things like that. So we're constantly predicting, we're constantly working towards that, and we do have a team, like I said, as we anticipated boredom and loneliness, for instance, first week into this, and that's when we started the research on that to see how we could support people in dealing with boredom and loneliness, for instance, and how leaders can support their people in that regard, right? So what's to come post pandemic? We feel like we're at the beginning of the middle of the pandemic. So we're more confident about what's going to happen in the next little while, but we're trying to anticipate what it's going to be like. There's various predictions out there. Are people going to want to now stay working from home? I'm skeptical. There was a push to work more from home, and people were liking that in some regards, and some people were not. The thing is, we're very capable of adjusting to new circumstances and situations. Human beings are very resilient as a species, and so I can say for sure that whatever the new normal looks like, we are going to adapt to it. We may not like it. I have no idea what the economic situation is going to look like on the other side of this, and I think that's going to be a big player. It's not that we're necessarily going back into the same work world that we left, just for the economic impacts. And that's not our area of expertise for sure. So if a group of economists comes to some consensus about what it's going to look like there, then I can start to make some projections as to what the psychology around that might look like. But those are the unknown unknowns that I don't have access to. So I'm going to say that a lot of extroverts are probably going to never ever want to work from home again, even though it might be a good thing for them in some cases where they could, reduce commute times. Even when we're going to working from home, there was a push to say, well, let's not work from home every day of the week. right? Let's have a couple of days in the office or a couple of days on site and balance it out that way. And I think that's more a reasonable. It depends on the nature of the work you're doing, of course. Right? Some work can never be done from home. So I wish I had a better crystal ball for you.
I know, like you said, it's hard to predict. Everybody has their assumptions. I think co-working spaces are going to be a hot place for people, extroverts, to hop back into, where you can go mingle with 50 or 100 other small businesses or entrepreneurs that are all trying to rent rooms. And it's really tough to say, and
Great point. Yeah.
it's going to be hard to see what it just feels like to be able to go outside and be around people again. And my wife, I called her about half an hour before we got on the call, because she was going out to pick up some meat, because a lot of the high-end restaurants in Toronto, I mean, everything's shut down. They're not purchasing food anymore. So these companies have transitioned to selling these high quality meats and wine and vegetables to the general public to keep their supply going. And I called her, and she was laughing, and I said, "What happened?" She goes, "I just got in shit from the lady at the grocery store for standing too close to her when I was picking my strawberries out." It's going to be either everybody's out there hugging and kissing when they go back on the street, or everybody's going to stay 6 feet apart. And I'm not sure which way it's going to go.
Well, and part of our team is looking at post Spanish flu 100 years ago and
Yeah.
what happened. And of course, we didn't have the benefit of social media then, but it looked like it took upwards of 18 months for folks to sort of feel trusting enough after several waves of the Spanish flu to sort of re-engage fully in the social ways that they once did. I
Hmm.
can't say that that's the way it's going to be this time, and the amount of ways of communicating information today are far quicker and broader in scope. So, but yeah, it still will take probably some time for people to trust. Stay away from me when you pick out your damn strawberries, because my limbic system is going off, and
Yeah,
I'm going to get mad
exactly.
at you, right? So I do the grocery shopping for my family once every 2 weeks, and that's the amount that we go out, and it's exhausting going out there
Oh,
because
it
my
is waiting in
brain
lines, and oh, it's crazy.
watching for potential threats, and our brain is not wired for this kind of threat. Our brain is wired for a threat that we can see, that we can know the danger of, and we can know what we can do to protect ourselves. So our brains were sort of wired for being out there and looking for threats in the grass or the woods that made loud noises, and we could see the threat of. This virus we can't see. We don't know when it's attacking. If we have been attacked by it, we won't know when it was that we were attacked. And that's
Hmm.
exactly not what are wired for. Our brains are wired to protect us from saber-toothed tigers, right? That's and do I run from it or do I punch it? And I can't punch a virus, and I can't run from it.
But when you see that lady that sneezes in the grocery store,
Oh man, she is the threat, right?
yeah,
She's the new saber-toothed tiger.
that's it.
And I have friends who they have a persistent cough and they don't go out because it's a persistent cough they had long before COVID. But they are now
They're
the
the
threat.
target.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so
Oh,
they just
that's
don't
too
go.
funny.
So this is a threat that really requires the prefrontal cortex to be operating to understand. And our limbic brain wants to take control and say, fight, freeze, or flee the situation.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, Ted, this has been fantastic. I've learned so much from you. I really enjoyed having this conversation. I hope it provides value to others. And is there anything else that we didn't touch on or that you wanted to leave behind for people to think about before we wrap up?
Leader in a formal sense or team member, do everything you possibly can to bring forward that organization of self that really is confident, calm, and compassionate, right? Part of your in group. That is the single best thing you do for yourself when you can. Takes energy, I know, to get into that. And understand too when I say being confident, being calm, and being compassionate. Look, confidence, even when you're not entirely confident, calmness, even if you're not feeling that calmness within yourself. Sort of, it's not fake it till you make it. It's practice it until you become it. So you're intentionally trying to bring that forward, and don't leave out that I'm on your side, I'm in your in group, that compassion or that kindness to that mix. That is really, as far as we can tell, the very best thing you can do for your own limbic system and for bringing down other people's limbic systems. That's what I would leave you with.
Awesome. And where can people find you or get in touch with your organization if they are looking to deploy some of your services or just get in touch? Where's the best place to reach you guys?
Yeah, we're on the web at vokesassociates.com, and we have a Facebook page for the practice, vokesassociates.com. The thing is that the spelling of Vokes is often different than what people are looking for. So our version, so it's VOKES Associates, and that's how you can find us. And we'll be happy to help out in any way. We also are putting out some briefs that are free for download on LinkedIn at vokesassociates.com, where you can, so you're working from home, do these things, you'll be fine. There's one brief already. There's another one coming out that will be around. So you're still working from home, or so you're still in the midst of COVID. Here's some things you can do, right? And that'll be focused on boredom and loneliness and things. So those are free resources. We're happy for folks to download and use them if they're helpful to them. And we're standing by.
Awesome. Well, I will be linking to everything as well on my website. And I do have a compilation of COVID-19 resources at toolspodcast.com/COVID-19 with no hyphen or spaces. And everything will be there, as well as your contact information and links to these downloads, as well as the interview itself. And I just want to thank you again for coming on, Ted, and giving me an hour of your time to talk about the limbic system. And for anybody else that's listening, stay prefrontal and avoid the limbic.
I love the way you're talking. Thank you, Colin, so much. It's been a real pleasure and a real honor to be on your podcast.
That's a wrap. That's a wrap, everybody.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Tools of the Trade podcast. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave us a 5-star review. For show notes, blog posts, resources, and access to our newsletter, check out toolspodcast.com.